Hello everyone, Rob Rousseau here, just reminding you to please smash the subscribe button as well as the bell and the thumbs up, leave a comment, and hey, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe over on Patreon, patreon.com/Rob Rousseau. Okay, that's all. I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Danny, thank you so much for joining us though.
It is good to be here, and I look forward to the discussion, the conversation.
Great. Well, do you want to just introduce yourself? I know a number of people in the chat are familiar with your work that you do, but you want to just let everyone know, just say hi, introduce yourself, and let you know where they can find your work and the kind of work commentary that you do.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I am an independent journalist. I'm a socialist, and I primarily am a contributor to the Black Agenda Report, which has weekly issues every Wednesday. I also have contributed to places like Mint Press News, The Gray Zone, elsewhere. And I also co-host a YouTube show called The Left Lens and another show called The Internationalist Transmission on the same channel. I do a lot of commentary on China, on anti-imperialism, socialism, racism, and the connections between all of these things in the class struggle. And you can find me on Twitter at Spirit of Ho, Spirit of HO. And if you are able, you can contribute to my journalism financially at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong.
Great. Well, so we appreciate you taking the time again. So Danny, I mean, the main thing we've been talking about this week, one common subject on this show that we've been talking about over the last year is about the intensifying propaganda war between China that has really ramped up in intensity over the last year or two. It's been really kind of alarming, especially as you see, I think, speaking personally, seeing people that I like and respect kind of getting pulled into this, into making these kinds of anti-China arguments, and sometimes I think unknowingly or unwittingly increasing or contributing to this increasing this increasingly tense and hostile kind of environment, geopolitical environment. So, what has it been like for you? Have you noticed these trends as well over the last 2 years? And how has this been for you to notice this intensifying propaganda war, the early stages of this new Cold War? And how are you in this current moment? How are you kind of feeling about all these complex geopolitical issues?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think for me, what is most concerning, as you said, is that there is this kind of broad spectrum of support that you see in the United States and the West for this propaganda war against China, and that it has serious consequences in the real world, serious policy consequences. And those are being played out as we speak. I mean, Congress just passed the so-called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which literally says that any corporations that do business in Xinjiang province, for example, must prove to the United States government that they're not using forced labor. So they have to prove before there's any investigation. So basically guilty until proven innocent. And this comes on the heels of the Summit for Democracy, which over the last 2 days has very subtly, but at times very directly attacked China. I mean, we had Nathan Law speak today for about 2 minutes. A lot of the most, I think, inflammatory speeches, including Joe Biden's remarks at the beginning and end of the summit, were very short. And so Nathan Law, this NED, National Endowment for Democracy-backed Hong Kong opposition figure, was given a platform to speak, despite all of the work that's been done by so many to expose the fact that he and people like him, those who he has worked with, are literally appendages of the United States' overall agenda, which it really is the purpose for the propaganda war, which is to contain China and to try to divide China, try to defame China, and really try to weaken China on the world stage by any means necessary. And I think for the last 2 years, what's been so striking is how quickly public opinion has shifted against China. I mean, public opinion in the United States was relatively modest and positive about China for so many years, even during the Obama administration's so-called pivot to Asia, where all of these military assets were transferred to the South China Sea and the Asia Pacific. There still was a relatively benign feeling on the part of people in the United States towards China. So this shift, which many have blamed primarily on the Trump administration, and surely the Trump administration played a huge role, especially in terms of the rhetoric, the racist rhetoric around COVID-19, calling it the China virus, all of that. And of course, all of the policies that happened during his administration, which directly targeted China. But the Biden administration has been no better. This is really a bipartisan policy. And it's one that doesn't get as much attention as, let's say, Russiagate, for example. We've had so many commentators on the left rightfully expose Russiagate as the conspiracy that it was to both scapegoat Russia for the political illegitimacy of the U.S. political system, and also further the geopolitical ambitions of the U.S. empire abroad, and also increase and heighten the surveillance state at home and abroad. And the same really goes for what's going on with China. This new Cold War on China has similar policy outcomes, just different in form, because the situation is a bit different. China, unlike Russia, is actually a burgeoning economy. Its economy is growing rapidly. And unlike Russia as well, China is competing and doing things that the United States is just incapable of doing right now. So China is able to lift the living standards of the vast majority of people in the country, something that the United States just has no way of doing. China is able to address the climate crisis in a real robust way and really set an example to the world on how to invest in renewable energy, for example. And the United States just can't do that. So what the United States has done is to shift all of its animus almost to China as a means to try to hold on to however many years left it has of being the number one economic superpower. But slowly but surely and more and more rapidly, we're going to see China be the economic superpower, while the United States will just have to be satisfied with military hegemony. That's sort of where the United States has compensated for all of its insecurities about its position in the world. And so for me, over the last 2 years, it's been quite striking to see how effective the propaganda has been. I think that is really a lesson here, because in 2019, I wasn't even really paying attention to the U.S.'s relationship with China, other than maybe the pivot to Asia and how dangerous I thought that was. But it has become sort of people call it a new Cold War, some call it a hybrid war, but it's become this overall political, economic, and military orientation that the U.S. has adopted, which is very, very dangerous. And right before COVID-19, I was able to go to China, and already people were very nervous about the U.S.'s orientation to China. There was already a lot of fear about even traveling to the United States, but pre-COVID-19, because of how hostile the rhetoric had become, and because there were already policies that were being put into place to demonize China on the world stage and to ramp up both the economic and military policies, which have really done a lot of damage to the world, real concrete material damage that I think a lot of people have turned their eyes away from. When the U.S. is militarizing the Asia Pacific, there's huge environmental consequences and economic consequences for those countries and regions. And when the U.S. decides to sanction Chinese technology, for example, there are huge consequences, not just for the United States' own backwardness technologically, because it is falling further and further behind, and sanctions certainly do not help that, but also in hurting the livelihoods of people, not just in China and, for example, Xinjiang, where the United States is now trying to close up all investment that has been happening there for many, many, many years, but also around the world, trying to prevent China's ability to support global South countries and other countries in creating a more advanced economic order so that real difficult material problems like extreme poverty can be addressed in this era. So yeah, I mean, I think the most striking part about all of this is that despite the obvious dangers, despite the fact that this conflict that the U.S. is leading can only lead to devastating consequences and already has in so many respects, there still is a lot of either outright support or just tepid sort of inattention to it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It has been. It feels, especially over the last 2 years, like it's kind of like the classic frog in boiling water moment. I know for me personally, when I started noticing the way that the Hong Kong protests are being endlessly talked about, these breathless reports in Western media, and just knowing the sort of long history of the way that these color revolutions often work in Latin America and these other places, where these kinds of opposition groups or these protests are really like talked about endlessly in the media, while ignoring similar protests elsewhere in U.S. client states. But I think seeing that and then still not being totally sure of like what geopolitical forces were at play, and I think it's just become more and more clear as these things have been continuing to escalate over the last 2 years. And that's the thing I wanted to focus on something you said about this act that just passed about forced labor in Xinjiang, because I think this is an example of the U.S. kind of, what they would do in traditional situations, in countries where they didn't have this big like intertwined economic interests in Latin America or elsewhere in Southeast Asia. They could just go in and arbitrarily sanction these countries and create this kind of economic chaos, which they then, they use to further destabilize these countries and further their own geopolitical goals. It kind of feels like with a lot of this human rights discourse in Xinjiang and focusing on cotton production and these things, it's like a way to sanction China kind of unofficially and to just withdraw this Western investment as a way of creating more instability and more joblessness, and to put a dent in, as you said, in the economic growth, which has been incredible. The economic growth in Xinjiang over the last decade, 10, 15 years, has really been remarkable. And it's like, it's a way for them to kind of subtly put pressure on that rather than going about their normal strategy of deliberately targeting these places with economic sanctions or blockades or whatever, because they're not really in the same position to do that. But do you think there's an element of that that's true?
Oh, definitely. I definitely think that is true. And it's a really good point about how the U.S. picks on smaller countries, picks on countries whose economies are much more vulnerable, much more underdeveloped. China is still considered an undeveloped country. It has a GDP per capita that's about 5 times smaller than the United States is. However, China is so interconnected with the overall world economy. I mean, that was part of the strategy for raising living standards and rapidly growing its economy over the last 40 years was to open up not only to investment, but to cooperation as well, to be able to, on the one hand, learn from more advanced Western economies that were capitalist in character, while at the same time still being able to achieve socialist objectives at home. And so it is much harder for the United States to bully China. That's, I think, one of the reasons why we see such a broad offensive rather than, let's say, how the United States treats Venezuela, where it'll sanction Venezuela to starvation, will fund opposition groups, will anoint Juan Guaido, who was supposed to speak at the Summit for Democracy and didn't end up doing so, but they'll support someone like him. And all of it is about creating political instability, but it is a very basic kind of policy agenda, one that kind of undergirds and underscores how Venezuela has been kept underdeveloped, has a much more dire economic struggle than China, which 70 plus years of sovereignty has done China a lot of good in the sense that it has a base to be able to withstand certain economic measures. And if the United States tries to isolate China too much on any one of these fronts, there's likely to be blowback politically from countries around the world. It's already happened, right? So on this Xinjiang issue and Uyghur genocide, right? You have majority Muslim nations across Africa and the Middle East completely non-supportive of this policy that the United States has taken. Even the Summit for Democracy, a country like Pakistan, which the U.S. has deep intelligence ties to, Pakistan refused to go to the Summit for Democracy because of what message it would send to China. And Pakistan really does need China's economic cooperation. I mean, the first public transit system in Pakistan was built with assistance from China. So there are deep bonds there with the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So the blowback to this offensive is very delicate and is very imminent should the United States go too far. But the U.S. is constantly, because the military industrial complex is really driving things in terms of policy towards China, there's a lot of testing the waters. So the reports, for example, out of Taiwan, stating that the U.S. had been sending troops there for many years now, was just one of the ways in which the military industrial complex is playing a very dangerous game. And at the same time that Joe Biden's administration was having supposedly diplomatic talks, right, in Zurich with top diplomats in China, with the trade representative Catherine Tai of the United States, and representatives of the economy in China. While these things were happening and Joe Biden was talking to Xi Jinping, the CIA was stating that China is the biggest threat to the international order, and that the CIA was going to now direct all of its attention to China's rise and how to stop it by opening mission centers and trying to figure out how to spy on China, because they admit that it's been very difficult to do so. And so I think that there is this sort of paradoxical approach that the U.S. takes when it comes to China, that requires for the military industrial complex and for these powerful interests in the capitalist class, in order for them to really be satisfied, they have to take this multi-pronged, almost contradictory, counterproductive approach on so many things. Xinjiang is one of them. It's like, if you really want to address the climate crisis, you should probably be helping Xinjiang produce even more renewable energy, because that's where a lot of solar comes from, the vast majority of it. If you really want to boost the U.S. economy, you might not want to threaten the South China Sea with military conflict, because that's where the vast majority of world trade comes from. You know, the South China Sea is where most of world trade sails through. So a lot of it just demonstrates, I think, a lot of this approach to China demonstrates how the U.S. empire is completely moribund. It doesn't have any options. It's sort of trying to figure out a way to maintain its hegemony, while at the same time understanding that it really can't stop the course of history right now. The course of history is showing and demonstrating that the U.S. is really a thing of the past. Its dominance, its economic supremacy, its legitimacy politically, all of this is really a thing of the past, domestically and around the world. And it's really all about how does the United States contain and eradicate any threat to this? So China is probably the number one mission of the United States, but of course, all of its regime change operations and all of the ways in which it treats domestic political movements for social change, legitimate social change, also indicate. I mean, we had today Julian Assange, right? The appeal to extradite him was successful, and so that happened at the same time as this ridiculous, International Human Rights Day, and the Summit for Democracy was happening at the same time that Julian Assange was being, successfully not yet extradited, but the go-ahead was given today. So I mean, this just speaks to where the United States is at.
Yeah, and of course, these values of the freedom of press and the free exchange of ideas, this is what people that kind of fetishize this Western liberal democracy will often hold up as examples for how our system is so much more superior than these quote unquote kind of authoritarian countries that don't have these freedoms. While, you know, whenever these examples come up of these ideas or these concepts being completely arbitrary and not actually these ironclad values at all, which they somehow just kind of like hand wave away, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly it. That's how valuable American exceptionalism is at this point in the history of the United States. It really is. You know, at one point during World War II, for example, the United States, at the very least, could boast about how its growing capitalist economy, no matter how it got there, which it got there through exploiting a world war, no matter how the United States got to its economic dominance, that it still could provide, right? It could provide for a good number of workers, not all workers, but a good number of workers in the United States, a better living standard than they had during the 30 Years crisis. And it could also say, well, because we are this economic powerhouse, our democracy, quote unquote, is by far superior to the alternative, which at that time was the Soviet Union and the Cold War that was set off right after World War II, or at least put into overdrive, because the United States had been trying to undermine the Soviet Union during World War II, prior to World War II.
I would say the Cold War basically just went on pause for a few years during the war and then resumed and with exponential more intensity.
Exactly.
And it's something that you're touching on as well, which is I find very fascinating. It's something that comes up often when we have these discussions on this show, talking about the ways that, as a result of this kind of like the economic partnership that has developed between China and the West over the last 30 years, has made it much more difficult for the United States to push around China and to treat China as it has previously with these kinds of client states. And it results in these kind of contradictory and sometimes like harmful methods of dealing with this current reality. And that's kind of one of the things that we've talked about often on the show, is that you're seeing a lot of the economic decisions that have been made in China starting in the Deng period in the late 80s, which were very controversial. If you're kind of an international leftist at the time, there was a number of people that I think just assumed that China had decided to play ball with the West, that had decided to open itself up to foreign capital, and had decided to embrace these kind of harmful or contradictory or exploitative economic practices. But now it's not quite so cut and dry as that, and you're seeing the results both in their economic growth and in the inability of the United States to continue to push them around as they would normally. You're seeing how some of the logic of these decisions from the late 70s and 80s are starting to make a lot more sense now. And that I think a lot of these decisions have, although controversial for many years, have been somewhat vindicated by just the process that we're seeing play out right now, right?
Yeah. And I think it sort of almost is a double take for a lot of people, because of how influential left ideas from 30, 40, 50 years ago continue to shape how we think about, right? This very Cold War logic, it continues to shape how we think about China and the Sino-Soviet split, China and the Soviet Union's conflict with each other. I mean, that was very damaging, and it came within a very hostile context. It came with a lot of contradictions, and it really, with all of the infiltration and all of the Cold War sort of propaganda that was being fed to American workers and leftists and communists, and it had an impact. And to this day, you still have a lot of people on the left, even if they're not supportive of the Cold War rhetoric, right? If they're not supportive of war with China, they hold on to what really are outdated understandings of this period of reform and opening up, which began in the late 70s. And it really is a misreading of Chinese history, because at the founding of the People's Republic of China, and even in Mao's early essays, there was a lot of talk on what new democracy would look like, on what early socialist development would look like. And it was pretty clear that ensuring that there was some kind of robust private market economy was going to be crucial because of China's overall state of underdevelopment, that there was really no hope for China's revolution in its own context to really survive in the context of extreme rural poverty, which was what the state of the country was in 1949. And even in 1978, China was still one of the poorest countries in the world, albeit with a much stronger base of social welfare and socialist policies. So since reform and opening up, I mean, I think we've seen, of course, the eradication of extreme poverty happen in 2020 of November. And we've seen how well China has addressed the COVID-19 pandemic, which stems from how well it addressed the SARS epidemic in 2003. We've seen how China has been able to, rather than in this period of global neoliberal austerity and privatization, has been able to maintain a robust state-owned economy in the most important areas of economic development, so that things like infrastructure, certain living standards, wage scales could be maintained and even expanded in a time where the rest of the world is going in the opposite direction, where extreme poverty is exploding and where foreign multinational corporations are really running free reign over the global South, and as well as the United States and the so-called advanced capitalist countries. One of the things that you can notice about the condemnation of China, especially by economic analysts, so if you read the Financial Times, actually, I would suggest people read George Soros's very pathetic screeds on China, and places like the Wall Street Journal, where he seems to have an op-ed there every couple every season almost, warning about the threat of China. He will say it straight up. There's no hesitation from someone like him. He says China is a threat to the so-called free market economy, that China's model is so-called authoritarian and it's treating private companies like state assets, right? And I think that is a huge indication that even though in the early period of reform and opening up, the United States, of course, given its geopolitical ambitions, it wanted to isolate the Soviet Union. It also wanted to take advantage of a very cheap labor force at the time. The rest of the West and even Japan was very much like, let's do business. This is a great deal. Like we'll do technology transfers. We'll directly invest in your economy.
You can count on me.
We'll
You're gonna have good old Rob
go into contracts around economic development as long as we can profit off of that cheap labor. Now, because standards have risen in China, because China really isn't this low wage labor pool like it used to be, now the fruits of this policy are being seen for China and really the rest of the world, because as China's living standards grow, the capacity and opportunities for other countries in a similar situation to China, they grow exponentially just by having that example of a modernizing non-white country of 1.4 billion people. So I think we're really seeing this kind of change of the guard, right? From this like Western imperial era of domination to a new model where China is not even down for that like hegemony stuff. It's not trying to say that it's going to dictate what other countries do, no matter how much the United States claims that's the case. China is very clear. And all of its allies are very clear. And that's why you see like Nicaragua, now that it has consolidated its leadership with the FSLN and the socialist movement there, we now see Nicaragua say, hey, yeah, we want to reestablish relations. China has a lot to offer, and it's been a friend in the past. The same goes for most of the progressive Latin American countries, from Bolivia to Cuba. And the same goes, of course, for the African continent, which gets the most sort of flack and ire from the United States, where, and every single African country has really strong relations with China. And no matter what the character of the government is, they basically all say the same thing. They say that China is providing us with critical infrastructure needs, and that a lot of this is done without strings attached to our political system. So yes, China isn't going to tell Uganda how to run its government, nor will it tell Ethiopia how to run its government. Meanwhile, the United States is doing quite the opposite on the African continent and everywhere else. And this contradiction is being exposed for more and more and more to see the more and more that the US just loses the capacity to legitimately compete, to be able to say to countries, oh, you want 5G technology, you want high-speed rail from China? Well, we can offer that and more. That's not even close to the case, right? Yeah. I think China's trade volume in Africa is something like $200 billion or something of the sort. And the United States is like something like 39 billion. So it's not even close to being able to touch what China is able to do, despite the fact that China still has a GDP, still has regions of its own country that still need basic necessities. I mean, extreme poverty is gone, but there is still relative poverty and things to address. And so I think the fact that China is able to balance these things together is a very fascinating lesson into, the successes of reform and opening up, the very practical successes, because we can talk all about our ideological differences with allowing a private market and capitalist economy to kind of supplement socialism. We can talk about if you ideologically disagree with that, but in the real world, right, how does a country that, where most people were making annually less than $100 a year and dying before the age of 40, how does a country like that become what China is now? And surely we see that the road that China has taken in the final analysis is correct, regardless of whatever bumps have come along the way. And the bumps are still there. That's why they're addressing income inequality and this issue of common prosperity, which has also been subject to a lot of criticism from the United States, unsurprisingly.
Yeah, and they also seem to be kind of reining in some of the excess that's emerged from this kind of like nouveau riche class that's arisen as part of these reforms, right? And I also wanted to mention too, because like what we're talking about, I find that very interesting, this concept of not dictating what's going on in these other governments. But what I do find interesting and fascinating and very encouraging as well is not so much that China's interested in dictating what these governments do. What it is doing is providing an alternative for development for these global South countries. For the last 70 years, there's been one alternative, the United States way, the IMF, the World Bank, and they have to do things within this context exclusively. And if they don't, they become kind of an official enemy of the United States, which then seeks to, destroy whatever gains they've built or whatever, overthrow their government or whatever, sanctions and destabilization efforts, all this kind of stuff. There's now an alternative to that. And as you're pointing out, numerous countries in the global South, like in Africa and Central and South America and elsewhere, are choosing that alternative because they know full well what the U.S. model for development has looked like for these nations. Particularly in Africa, it's been a disaster. Capitalist development in places like Congo has just been a human rights disaster. And these people that live in these nations understand this full well. And that's the thing, is that China doesn't even have to really dictate these terms to these countries, because just offering that alternative has been such an amazing opportunity for these nations to develop without the boot of U.S. imperialism, enforcing a very strict vision of what they do for the entire time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in my research, because I'm actually giving a talk on Sunday, so 2 talks. There's one for something I co-edit, Friends of Socialist China, the Summit for Socialist Democracy. So please do register for that if you can. You can find it on the Friends of Socialist China Twitter page. And on Sunday, I'm going to be speaking at the organization International Manifesto Group on their panel on China-Africa relations. And in my research, I found something very staggering in that China's Huawei Corporation actually provides 70% of the whole continent's 4G technology, and is, of course, now introducing 5G to the continent. And I think that this is just such a staggering number. And this doesn't even get into like the 13,000 kilometers of rail that China has built, and the hundreds upon hundreds of power stations that China has helped develop to ensure that Africa, which is by far, I think, the wealthiest continent in the world, and still, because of the way that Western corporations exploit the continent privately and then via their mechanisms, financial mechanisms like the IMF, Africa runs a deficit of something like $45 billion every single year, right? What comes out of Africa ends up being $50 billion more than what goes in or what is kept in the continent. And I think the difference between the two, right? This idea that China is actually providing tangible benefits, tangible things that global South countries need, versus the United States, which is attached to a Western economic order that is completely extractive and exploitative. This is really the contradiction of our time. And it is exciting in the sense that China, although it has a policy of non-interference, China is also not afraid in the international arena to assert leadership over matters of principle, like, for example, the sanctions, right? So China has vehemently opposed sanctions against Syria, the Caesar sanctions, the sanctions against Venezuela, against Cuba, all sanctions China has been vehemently opposed to, including sanctions, of course, on itself that the United States has imposed on certain sectors like the technology sector. So I think, yeah, it is very exciting in so many respects because of the opportunities that can come. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a reason why it's been so demonized, is because, well, when you're throwing around $1 trillion worth of public dollars, we're not talking about the vast majority, right? We're not talking about these private companies just traveling across the world, Chinese private companies traveling across the world, doing whatever they want. No, the Exim Bank of China, the Import-Export Bank, that is a state-owned bank. The same goes for a lot of the corporations that are doing the infrastructure projects in these countries across the global South and in your Eastern Europe, et cetera. They're state-owned banks. This is public money that is being invested in order to lift the poorest parts of the world to a scale similar to China's at some point in history, because there's a recognition that if things like climate change, poverty, if these things are really going to be addressed in any significant way, then everybody has to be lifted up. It's sort of like the actual a rising tide lifts all boats being applied to the world stage. And I think that's something that we can all learn from and certainly distinguish it from how the U.S. is behaving and how its allies are behaving, because that is the cold hard truth that no amount of propaganda can really erase unless we remain within our silos, which are very easily to remain in, given the pandemic and given the relative isolation of left politics in the US. But this kind of world movement, this shift that's going on, is very exciting and does hold a lot of opportunities.
Yeah. Before you go, Danny, I know you don't have too much longer. I just did want to ask you if you could briefly get into, because I know, unlike many of the Western journalists who talk endlessly about Xinjiang and the human rights atrocities which are occurring there, which are just this constant source of breathless discourse in our media, and it's the reason for why we need to increase tensions and hostility with China, why we need to sanction these companies. Why we need to be fearful and mistrustful of this, why we need to do this diplomatic boycott, for example, like what Canada and the United States is doing right now. Unlike many of the Western journalists that talk about this endlessly, you've actually been to Xinjiang. So just before you have to go, I was just wondering if you could just give us a little impression about what your time was like when you were actually physically there to see what's happening, and how that relates to the narrative that's been spread about this place in Western media and has really intensified over the last year or two.
Yeah, no, this has been something very important to me, and I've written a bit about it because of my own personal experiences going there, and because of how I think this really does represent the most dangerous part of the propaganda war, because it sort of touches upon the most sensitive limitations of the liberal class. It really does mobilize everybody, including those who are so-called left of Democrat, to be very skeptical of China and to tacitly then ignore the policy consequences of the US's so-called response to these allegations and claims, and to not even want to investigate them because there's already this very, I mean, to be honest, it's a really yellow peril kind of racist jingoification of China, where the government and the society is painted as this rights-free arena where this one particular ethnic group out of 50 plus is being targeted for no real reason at all beyond lust for control and oppression, right? So we completely detach the material basis for oppression itself, and therefore, I think, puts the left in a kind of a state of paralysis and in this really, really dark place of idealism that it still has a big impact today. And so when I was in Xinjiang, I was only there for about 3 days. I was in the capital of Urumqi, and this was right at the beginning of the concentration camps narrative, right? So there's 1 million to 2 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, which would represent like 10% of the like a huge percentage of the Uyghur population in particular. A very, very, very huge claim to make. So it was already bad at that time. Adrian Zenz was just making the rounds as sort of this figure that was a so-called scholar, legitimate source of information. And yeah, when I was there, I mean, what was so striking about it, well, first of all, what's so striking about it is you talk to people and they're very puzzled about what you mean. They're very skeptical. They don't like that they don't like the whole narrative. They don't understand it because really the pattern that's happened in Xinjiang over the last 30, 40 years has been one of improvement, right? That's been the sort of experience for the last few generations that have grown up in Xinjiang. It's been, okay, my life has improved. And that's what most people won't talk about, right? They talk about, okay, my life has improved. I'm making more money. I live in a much more stable place. My life is better than it was. Education is more accessible. Development is happening, and it's everywhere when you go to Xinjiang. I mean, Urumqi, despite being a relatively newly developed city, right? There's been a lot of capital poured into Urumqi in particular over the last 20 or so years. It's so incredible to watch and to see how quickly it's caught up with the rest of the country. I mean, there is high-speed rail in Xinjiang. There is like a lot of modern amenities. There is a lot of subsidized everything, the same as in other cities, transportation, public services, and life is pretty calm and peaceful there. And you see how this whole cultural genocide narrative just completely goes out the window when you see people actually practicing, going into mosques. They're practicing, people are dancing everywhere because that's just the culture in all of China. People are dancing everywhere to traditional cultural music. The language, the Uyghur language is everywhere. That's not being suppressed. You can't miss it because it's literally on every single sign that you see. And it's pretty striking that we are told all of these lies, and then you just go there, even just for a few days, you see the lay of the land in a city which had been the target of a lot of these attacks that China had to respond to. 2009 riots, 14, right? People died, like hundreds of people died in these incidents, and still China has been able to respond in a way that is much more humane than how the United States would respond to such a thing, right? Because what happens when a terrorist attack happens in the United States? Well, the whole entire police state becomes mobilized, more funding for that. and everything else is neglected. In fact, a lot of times it's used as a way to kind of shock doctrine in more neoliberal policies.
Yeah, to say nothing of the foreign invasions and bombings.
Yeah, and then all of that as well, right? So China didn't go around. Yeah, China. There are a lot of Uyghur separatists who are literally sitting in Turkey and they're sitting in Syria. And in Syria, they're armed and they're actually trying to overthrow the Syrian government alongside Al-Qaeda. China could easily say, actually, it would be their right to say, they were Chinese nationals before they made the trip. We want to try them. We want to do something, right? But they don't, because, at the end of the day, there is this coordinated international campaign led by the United States to sort of weaponize what had been what still is a longstanding problem in the region, Xinjiang bordering Afghanistan and a lot of countries that were destabilized by the U.S.'s war on terror, which is almost 40 years old now. So that, that was really my impression, was that, first of all, it's really cold there, so don't go there in January. It's like dry and cold, but it's so peaceful. The food is amazing. There's halal food everywhere. So it's not like, oh my God, you can't eat traditional, Islamic cultural food. It's just like all of the things you hear are essentially untrue, and people have just a different focus, right? So it would be interesting to go there now, given that this is now 2 years plus old and the narrative is even more heinous, right? When you elevate it to genocide now, it's not just some kind of cartoonish smear that has policy consequences. Now you're elevating it to possible calls for outright war. And it would be interesting to go there now and talk to people, because I'm sure there's been even more attention on how the United States is behaving in relation to just this particular region. And, the censorship, right? There are people who have been trying, people from Xinjiang, people who live in the region, who have been trying to access like U.S. social media, Twitter, trying to get a message out there that, hey, we're just trying to live our lives. Leave us alone. Please stop. And Twitter will censor them and they'll take them off of, they'll take away their accounts. Yeah. So, and that is the sort of atmosphere that we're in.
We've talked this week about how Twitter is partnering with think tanks like the ASPI, who have been one of the central drivers of this narrative, partnering with the ASPI to ensure that these narratives that run contrary to these national security establishment narratives are never kind of allowed or tolerated on these social media networks.
Exactly. ASPI, I mean, the day after AUKUS, right, this submarine agreement, a nuclear submarine agreement between the U.S., Australia and the UK, which will probably never come to fruition in our lifetimes, but it really was kind of a political pact of, okay, Australia, the UK was already there, its junior partner, Australia was essentially there, but now this has kind of made it official. The day after that, ASPI opened an office in Washington, D.C. for the first time. So ASPI is a huge cog, a huge key element to everything that we're talking about, because as you said, yes, they were the primary drivers of all of this, from the genocide to the internment to the slave labor camps, all of it, right? Ridiculous characters like Nathan Rooser looking at Google Earth maps and just pointing to images saying, look, there's a camp, and it happens to be just like a high school or something. I mean, this is how debased it was. But when you look at who supports this effort, it is the U.S. Department of State, the Australian Department of Defense, and then the military-industrial complex. That literally is who funds the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and yet it is still allowed to pose as this independent think tank, which is on this crusade to save the Uyghurs from human rights violations. It's absolutely criminal, but it speaks to how important this question is to the United States, because there's obviously is a lot of investment in it. And although I'm now having suspicions, and call me a conspiracy theorist, but there was this Associated Press article that came out not too long ago. I was just going to bring this up. Yeah, where they said, oh yeah, it's short of genocide, but things are really bad. That was sort of the theme of the article. And it was almost like a walk back. But I tend to think that that was almost like an operation, so to speak, in the sense that it cooled things down a bit. And then what did you have? You had Enes Kanter's strange crusade against China as he tries to adopt the CIA mentality and character of his mentor, Fatullah Gulen, or whether you're talking about this recent act that was passed in Congress, all of it points to the fact, or the Summit for Democracy points to the fact that this human rights, humanitarian interventionism towards China or anywhere else is not going away. It'll actually probably ramp up leading up to the February 2022 Olympics, where China's success around COVID-19, China's success around renewable energy, all of that is going to be on display at the Winter Olympics, where the world will experience this for really the first time, because China has been doing such an incredible job with COVID-19. But, for the most part, international travel has been very limited.
Yeah, no, I wanted to bring up that AP article too, because it's just, you talked about how this narrative has really ramped up in intensity. And when that article came out, which essentially said like, oh, so all the stuff that everyone's been saying turns out is not quite happening in the same way that we've been describing. All these these camps and these terrible things were happening are apparently closed or they're gone away. But it's still very sinister, and it's still very alarming, all the stuff that's going on. I kind of thought that might have an impact of cooling things, as you said, but it seems like the opposite has happened. And the calls for investigation and the accusations of genocide and all these things have only increased. I wish people would be able to just take the basic fact that like a lot of this conversation started from literally Mike Pompeo, the former head of the CIA, on the final days of the Trump administration, making this claim. You'd think that just in and of itself would be enough to show people that there's something more happening here. There's something more at play that we shouldn't just uncritically accept. But for some reason, people have a really difficult time parsing this. And it's, I got to say, it's a little discouraging. But I do really appreciate the work that you do in dispelling a lot of these narratives. I know it's a really kind of tense time as this Cold War rhetoric and all this tension is being ratcheted up. And I know that it's not always easy to stand on the other side of that, calling for further cooperation and this kind of and further friendship and peace and this kind of thing. But I appreciate the work that you do doing this. And thanks very much for coming on the show today to talk to us. It was a really great conversation.
Oh, yeah, no, for sure. Thanks so much for having me on, and I appreciate it.
So you mentioned up front where everyone can find all your work. We'll make sure that we relink all your projects again. But again, it was a great talk. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it, and hopefully you can come back again some other time.
Sure, for sure. Take good care.